The blade pressed against Laura King's throat, cold steel biting into her skin as Edward Myers leaned close enough that she could smell the whiskey on his breath and see the cruel satisfaction in his eyes. Behind him, three more men blocked the doorway of her small cabin, their faces twisted with the same predatory hunger that had haunted her nightmares for weeks. "You've been hiding from me long enough," Edward whispered, his free hand tangling in her dark hair. "Time to pay what you owe one way or another." Laura's heart hammered against her ribs as she pressed back against the rough wooden wall, her mind racing through impossible calculations. The debt her late husband had left behind was more than she could ever repay, and Edward had made it clear that her body would serve as suitable collateral. Her fingers trembled as they found the small paring knife hidden in her apron, but four armed men against one desperate woman seemed like insurmountable odds. The sound of heavy boots on her porch made Edward pause, his grip loosening slightly. A shadow fell across the doorway, and then a voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. "Step away from her!" The stranger who filled the doorframe was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He wore travel-worn clothes and carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had faced down death and emerged victorious. Laura had never seen him before, but something in his presence made her breath catch in her throat. Edward straightened, his knife still at Laura's neck, but his attention now focused on the newcomer. "This is none of your business, stranger. Move along. I'm making it my business." The man stepped into the cabin, and Laura noticed the way Edward's companions shifted nervously. "The lady looks like she needs assistance." "The lady owes me money," Edward snarled. "More than she can pay." "How much?" The simple question hung in the air like a challenge. Edward's eyes narrowed as he studied the stranger, clearly trying to assess whether this was a threat or an opportunity. $300, Edward said finally, plus interest. The stranger reached into his coat, and Edward tensed, but instead of a weapon, he produced a leather pouch that clinked with the sound of coins. "Here's 400. That should cover the debt and the interest you mentioned." Laura stared in shock as the stranger tossed the pouch onto her small wooden table. The coins spilled out, glinting gold and silver in the lamplight. It was more money than she had seen in years. Edward's grip on her loosened further as greed warred with suspicion in his expression. "Why would you pay her debt?" "Because I heard she needs a husband," the stranger said calmly, "and I'm willing to give her strong children." The words hit Laura like a physical blow. She had never seen this man before in her life, had never spoken to him or even heard his name. Yet here he stood, offering to pay her debts and claim her as his wife in the same breath. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. Edward's knife finally moved away from her throat as he stepped toward the money, his attention consumed by the unexpected windfall. "You want to marry her? You can have her. She's nothing but trouble anyway." "The debt is paid," the stranger said firmly. "Take your money and leave." Edward scooped up the coins with greedy hands, his earlier threats forgotten in the face of easy profit. He jerked his head toward his companions, and they began to file out of the cabin. At the doorway, Edward paused and looked back at Laura with cold eyes. "You got lucky this time," he said, "but luck runs out eventually." Then they were gone, leaving Laura alone with the stranger who had just bought her freedom at the cost of her independence. She pressed her back against the wall, her hand still gripping the paring knife in her apron. "Who are you?" she whispered. "Joshua Ramirez," he said simply, "and I meant what I said. I heard you need a husband." 3 weeks earlier, Laura King had stood in the same spot, staring at the official notice that would change her life forever. The paper trembled in her hands as she read the words that spelled out her doom in cold legal language. Her husband Thomas had been dead for 6 months, killed in a mining accident that had left her alone in a harsh frontier town with nothing but debts in the small cabin they had called home. The notice informed her that Edward Myers, who held the majority of Thomas's gambling debts, was calling in what was owed. $300 plus 6 months of accumulated interest. The sum might as well have been $3,000 for all her ability to pay it. Laura sank into the single wooden chair by her fireplace, the notice falling from nerveless fingers to flutter onto the rough plank floor. Thomas had been a good man in many ways, But his weakness for cards and whiskey had ultimately destroyed them both. She had known about the gambling, had pleaded with him to stop, but he had always promised that the next game would be different, that he would win back everything they had lost and more. Instead, he had died owing money to the most dangerous man in 3 counties. Edward Myers was not known for his patience or his mercy. He owned the largest saloon in town, along with several other businesses of questionable reputation. Men who crossed him had a tendency to disappear, and women who caught his attention rarely escaped unmarked. Laura had heard the stories whispered in the general store and around the church steps. She knew what Edward would demand when he came to collect. The thought made her stomach turn, but what choice did she have? She owned nothing of value except the cabin, which was mortgaged to the bank, and her own body. In a town where decent work for women was scarce and the winter was approaching fast, she had few options. That first week after receiving the notice, Laura had tried everything she could think of. She approached the bank about a loan, only to be turned away with barely concealed disdain. She visited every business in town, looking for work, but found only closed doors and sympathetic but unhelpful faces. The few jobs available to women paid so little that it would take years to earn enough to satisfy Edward's demands. She had even swallowed her pride and approached the church, hoping that Christian charity might provide some solution. Pastor Williams had listened to her story with genuine concern, but the church's coffers were nearly empty after a harsh winter and a poor harvest. He could offer prayers and a small basket of food, but nothing that would solve her fundamental problem. As the days passed and her options dwindled, Laura found herself considering increasingly desperate measures. She could try to run, but where would she go with no money and winter coming on? She could try to hide, but in a town the size of Cedar Falls, there was nowhere Edward wouldn't find her eventually. The worst part was the waiting. Every day brought her closer to the inevitable confrontation, and every night she lay awake listening to every sound outside her cabin, wondering if this would be the night Edward came to collect. She had taken to keeping the paring knife close at hand, though she wasn't sure she would have the courage to use it when the time came. It was during one of these sleepless nights that she overheard a conversation that would change everything. She had been sitting by her window, unable to sleep, when she heard voices from the street outside. 2 women were walking past, their voices carrying clearly in the still night air. "Poor thing doesn't know what's coming," one of them was saying. "Edward's been talking about her all over town. Says he's going to make an example of what happens when people don't pay their debts." "Someone should warn her," the other woman replied, "though I suppose it wouldn't matter. She's got no family, no money, no prospects." "What's she going to do?" "What she needs is a husband," the first woman said. "A man who could protect her from Edward and pay off those debts. But who's going to marry a woman with nothing to offer but trouble?" The conversation faded as the women moved on, but their words echoed in Laura's mind long after they were gone. A husband. It was so simple and so impossible at the same time. In a town where eligible men were scarce, and most of them already knew about her situation, the chances of finding someone willing to take on Edward Myers and $300 in debt were virtually non-existent. But the seed of an idea had been planted, and over the following days it began to grow. Laura found herself studying every unmarried man in town with new eyes, trying to assess which ones might be desperate or kind enough to consider such an arrangement. The results were discouraging. The few bachelors in Cedar Falls were either too young, too poor, or too smart to get involved in her troubles. That was when she remembered the stories she had heard about men in other territories, men who advertised for wives in newspapers and were willing to marry women they had never met. Mail-order brides, they called them. It was not an uncommon arrangement on the frontier, where women were scarce and men were willing to take chances on love and companionship. The idea both terrified and intrigued her. Could she really marry a complete stranger? Could she trust her life and her future to a man she knew nothing about? But as the days passed and Edward's deadline drew closer, the option began to seem less like desperation and more like salvation. Laura spent hours composing letters in her mind, trying to find the right words to explain her situation without sounding completely hopeless. She would need to be honest about the debt, about the danger, about the fact that she was not a young girl with a dowry, but a widow with nothing to offer but her willingness to work and her determination to survive. But before she could work up the courage to actually write such a letter, fate intervened in the form of a traveling merchant who stopped at her cabin looking for directions to the next town. The man was elderly and harmless, with kind eyes and a gentle manner that reminded her of her late father. "You look troubled, miss," he said after she had given him the directions he sought. "Is there anything an old man can do to help?" Something in his tone, or perhaps just the desperate need to tell someone about her situation, made Laura find herself pouring out the whole story. The merchant listened without judgment, nodding occasionally and making sympathetic sounds at the appropriate moments. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, stroking his grizzled beard thoughtfully. "I may know someone," he said finally. "A man I met a few towns back. He's looking for a wife, and he's got the kind of reputation that might make even Edward Myers think twice about causing trouble." Laura's heart leaped with hope and fear in equal measure. "What kind of man is he?" "Hard to say for certain," the merchant replied. "Keeps to himself mostly, but I've heard stories. They say he's handy with a gun and not afraid to use it when necessary. They also say he's honest and pays his debts. If you're serious about needing a husband, I could get word to him." The offer hung in the air between them like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. Laura knew she should ask more questions, should demand more information about this mysterious stranger who might be willing to take on her troubles. But time was running out, and options were scarce. "What would I need to tell him?" she asked. "The truth," the merchant said simply. "Men like that don't have patience for lies or games. If he's interested, he'll come. If not, you'll know soon enough." That night, Laura lay awake staring at the ceiling and weighing her choices. She could wait for Edward to come and face whatever he had planned for her. Or she could trust her future to a stranger who might or might not prove to be her salvation. Neither option offered any guarantee of safety or happiness, but at least one of them offered hope. In the morning, she gave the merchant her answer. The message Laura sent was simple and direct, stripped of any pretense or false promises. She told the truth about her husband's death, about the debt she had inherited, and about Edward Myers and his reputation for violence. She described her situation honestly, acknowledging that she had nothing to offer except her willingness to work hard and be a faithful wife to any man brave enough to take on her troubles. She also included a description of herself, trying to be neither too flattering nor too self-deprecating. She was 26 years old, of average height with dark hair and brown eyes. She could cook and clean and tend a garden. She had been married before and understood what was expected of a wife. She was not beautiful, but she was not ugly either. She was, she wrote, a woman who needed help and was willing to give everything she had in return. The merchant promised to deliver the message, and then he was gone, leaving Laura to wait and wonder if she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. The days that followed were torture, filled with doubt and second-guessing, and the growing certainty that no man in his right mind would involve himself in such a dangerous situation. But as the deadline Edward had given her drew closer, Laura found herself clinging to the hope that someone, somewhere, might be willing to take a chance on her. She cleaned her cabin obsessively, mended her few dresses, and tried to prepare herself for the possibility that a stranger might appear at her door and claim her as his wife. She also tried to prepare herself for the more likely possibility that no one would come at all. A week before Edward's deadline, Laura began to accept that her desperate gamble had failed. No mysterious stranger had appeared to rescue her, and no word had come from the merchant about whether her message had even been delivered. She was on her own, just as she had been from the beginning. That was when she began to plan her final desperate act. If Edward Myers wanted to make an example of her, she would at least ensure that the lesson came at a price. The paring knife she kept in her apron was small, but it was sharp enough to do damage if she could find the courage to use it. She would not go quietly into whatever hell Edward had planned for her. The night before the deadline, Laura sat by her fireplace and wrote letters she would never send. One was to her sister in St. Louis, explaining what had happened and why. Another was to Pastor Williams, thanking him for his kindness and asking him to pray for her soul. The third was to Thomas, her dead husband, telling him exactly what she thought of the mess he had left behind. Writing the letters helped somehow, even though she knew no one would ever read them. They would probably burn with the cabin after Edward was finished with her, but at least she had put her thoughts down on paper. At least someone, even if it was only herself, would know that she had not given up without a fight. She was still sitting by the dying fire when she heard the sound of a horse approaching her cabin. Her blood turned to ice as she realized that Edward had decided not to wait for morning after all. He was coming for her now in the darkness, when no one would see or hear what happened. Laura gripped the paring knife and moved to the window, trying to see who was outside. The moon was nearly full, casting enough light to reveal a single rider on a dark horse. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, but something about his posture seemed wrong for Edward Myers. This man sat his horse differently, with a kind of easy confidence that Edward had never possessed. The rider dismounted and approached her door, his footsteps measured and unhurried. When he knocked, it was with a firm but polite rap that sounded nothing like Edward's usual aggressive pounding. "Miss King?" The voice was deep and unfamiliar. "My name is Joshua Ramirez. I believe you sent word that you need a husband." Laura's knees nearly buckled with relief and terror. He had come, the stranger she had never seen, whose name she had not even known until this moment, had actually come in response to her desperate message. But now that he was here, standing outside her door in the middle of the night, she found herself paralyzed with uncertainty. What if he was worse than Edward Myers? What if this was some cruel joke, or a trap, or simply a case of mistaken identity? What if she opened the door and found herself facing a different kind of nightmare entirely? "Miss King," the voice came again, patient but concerned. "Are you all right?" Laura forced herself to move to the door, though she kept the paring knife hidden in her apron and made no move to lift the bar that secured it. "How do I know you are who you say you are?" she called through the thick wood. "You sent a message through an old merchant named Pete Carson," Joshua replied. "You told him about your husband Thomas and the debt he left behind. You said Edward Myers was demanding payment and that you needed help." The details were correct, but Laura still hesitated. "Why would you come? You don't know me. You don't owe me anything." There was a long pause before he answered. "I've been looking for a wife for some time now. Most women want things I can't give them. Security, comfort, a settled life in a civilized place. But you're not asking for any of that. You're asking for protection and partnership, and those are things I can provide. What do you want in return?" "A home," he said simply. "Someone to come back to. Children, if God wills it. A reason to stay in one place instead of always moving on." The honesty in his voice was somehow more convincing than any elaborate declaration would have been. Laura found herself lifting the bar and opening the door, though she kept the knife ready in her other hand. Joshua Ramirez was everything the moonlight had suggested and more. He was tall, probably in his early 30s, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to see everything. His clothes were well made but worn, the kind a man wore when he spent most of his time traveling. There was something about him that suggested both gentleness and danger, as if he could be either a protector or a threat depending on the circumstances. "May I come in?" he asked. "We have things to discuss, and the night has ears." Laura stepped aside to let him enter, acutely aware of how small and shabby her cabin must seem to a man who clearly had some means. Joshua looked around the single room with its rough furniture and meager possessions, but his expression showed no judgment or disappointment. "You keep a clean house," he said, settling into the chair she offered him. "That speaks well of your character." "I don't have much to offer," Laura said, remaining standing with her back to the wall. "The cabin is mortgaged, and I have no dowry, no family connections, nothing that would make me a desirable wife." "You have courage," Joshua replied. "It takes courage to send a message to a stranger asking for help. It takes more courage to open your door to that stranger when he arrives in the middle of the night. Or foolishness, perhaps, but I prefer to think of it as courage." They studied each other in the lamplight, two strangers trying to assess whether they could trust each other with their lives and futures. Laura found herself noticing details about him that she had missed in her initial shock. His hands were calloused but clean, the hands of a man who worked hard but took care of himself. His clothes, while worn, were of good quality and well maintained. Most importantly, his eyes held a steadiness that spoke of honesty and reliability. "Tell me about Edward Myers," Joshua said finally. Laura told him everything she knew about the man who held her fate in his hands. Edward's reputation for violence, his control over much of the town's business, his treatment of women who crossed him. She held nothing back, wanting Joshua to understand exactly what he would be facing if he chose to help her. "And the debt is $300? Plus interest. It could be as much as 400 by now." Joshua nodded thoughtfully. "I can pay it." "Just like that. I've been saving money for some time now. A man needs capital to start a new life." The casual way he spoke of such a large sum told Laura that Joshua Ramirez was not a poor man, whatever else he might be. But it also raised new questions about his background and his motivations. "What do you do for a living?" she asked. "I solve problems for people," he said. "Sometimes that involves finding things that are lost. Sometimes it involves protecting things that are valuable. Sometimes it involves making sure that justice is done when the law isn't sufficient." The careful phrasing told Laura that Joshua's work was probably not entirely legal, but she found that she didn't care. In a world where the law had failed to protect her from Edward Myers, perhaps what she needed was someone who operated outside its boundaries. "Are you wanted by the law?" "Not at the moment," he said with a slight smile. "I'm careful to choose my clients and my methods wisely." "And you're willing to marry me? A woman you've never met, who comes with nothing but trouble?" Joshua was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the lamplight. When he spoke, his voice was serious and thoughtful. "I've been alone for a long time, Miss King. I've traveled from town to town, taking whatever work I could find, never staying long enough to put down roots. It's a hard way to live, and it gets harder as a man gets older. I want something different now. I want a home, a family, a reason to build something, instead of just surviving from day to day." "And you think I can give you that?" "I think we might be able to give it to each other," he said, "if we're both willing to try." The proposal hung in the air between them, simple and practical and terrifying in its implications. Laura had dreamed of marrying for love, of finding a man who would cherish her and build a life with her based on mutual affection and respect. But those dreams had died with Thomas, buried under debt in desperation in the harsh realities of frontier life. What Joshua was offering was different. It was a partnership, a mutual arrangement based on need and pragmatism rather than romance. But it was also honest, which was more than she had gotten from her first marriage. "If I agree," she said carefully, "what would you expect from me?" "What any husband expects from a wife. A clean home, good meals, faithfulness, children if possible. In return, I would provide protection, financial support, and my own faithfulness." "And love?" Joshua considered the question seriously. "I can't promise to love you, Miss King. I don't know you well enough for that. But I can promise to respect you, to treat you with kindness, and to be a good husband to you. Love might come in time, or it might not. But respect and kindness are things I can guarantee." It was more honesty than Laura had expected, and somehow more comforting than false promises of instant devotion would have been. At least she would know where she stood with this man. "When would we marry?" she asked. "As soon as possible. Tomorrow, if we can find a preacher willing to perform the ceremony. The sooner you're legally my wife, the stronger your protection will be. And Edward Myers? Leave him to me." The quiet confidence in Joshua's voice sent a chill down Laura's spine, but it was not entirely an unpleasant sensation. For the first time in months, she felt as though someone was on her side, someone who was not afraid of Edward Myers or anyone else. "I need time to think," she said. "Of course, but don't take too long. From what you've told me, Myers will be here soon to collect his debt." Joshua stood to leave, and Laura found herself reluctant to see him go. His presence had filled the cabin with a sense of safety she had almost forgotten existed. "Where will you stay tonight?" she asked. "I have a camp outside of town. I'll be back in the morning for your answer." He paused at the door and looked back at her. "Miss King, whatever you decide, I want you to know that you're braver than you think you are. Not many women would have the courage to reach out for help the way you did." Then he was gone, leaving Laura alone with the biggest decision of her life. Laura spent the rest of the night pacing her small cabin, weighing her options and trying to imagine what her life would be like as Joshua Ramirez's wife. She had no illusions about the arrangement he was proposing. It would be a marriage of convenience, a practical solution to both their problems rather than a romantic union. But as the hours passed, she found herself thinking that perhaps that was not such a terrible thing. Her marriage to Thomas had begun with love, or what she had thought was love at the time. They had been young and optimistic, convinced that their feelings for each other would be enough to overcome any obstacle. But love had not been enough to stop Thomas from gambling away their future, and it had not been enough to protect her when he died and left her to face the consequences alone. What Joshua was offering was different. He was not promising her passion or romance, but he was promising her protection and security. He was not claiming to love her, but he was promising to respect her and treat her well. In a world where women had few choices and fewer protections, those promises might be worth more than all the romantic declarations in the world. As dawn broke over the mountains, Laura made her decision. She would marry Joshua Ramirez, not because she loved him or because she believed in fairy tale endings, but because he represented her best chance for survival and perhaps even happiness. It was not the choice she would have made a year ago, but she was not the same woman she had been a year ago. Desperation and loss had taught her to value practical virtues over romantic dreams. When Joshua returned that morning, she was ready with her answer. "Yes," she said simply. "I'll marry you." He nodded as if he had expected no other response. "Good. I've already spoken with Pastor Williams. He's agreed to perform the ceremony this afternoon." "This afternoon?" Laura's voice rose in surprise. "So soon? The sooner the better. Myers will expect to collect his debt today, and I want you legally protected before he arrives." The next few hours passed in a blur of preparation. Laura had nothing suitable to wear for a wedding, but Joshua surprised her by producing a simple blue dress from his saddlebags. "I thought you might need something appropriate for the occasion," he said when she stared at the garment in amazement. The dress was beautiful, made of soft wool in a shade that complemented her dark hair and brown eyes. It fit her perfectly, as if it had been made specifically for her. "How did you know my size?" she asked. "I have a good eye for such thing," he replied, but something in his tone suggested there was more to the story than he was telling. They were married that afternoon in the small church at the center of town, with Pastor Williams officiating and his wife serving as witness. The ceremony was brief and businesslike, more like a legal contract than a religious sacrament. Laura spoke her vows in a steady voice, promising to love, honor, and obey a man she had known for less than 24 hours. Joshua's voice was equally steady as he promised to love, honor, and protect her for as long as they both lived. When Pastor Williams pronounced them husband and wife, Joshua kissed her cheek with the same formality he might have used to seal a business agreement. Laura felt a strange mix of relief and disappointment. She was safe now, legally protected by marriage to a man who seemed both willing and able to defend her. But she was also bound to that same man, committed to a life she could not yet imagine with someone who remained essentially a stranger. After the ceremony, Joshua escorted her back to the cabin that was now their home. He had already moved his few possessions inside, and Laura was struck by how little space they took up. A worn leather saddlebag, a rifle, a bedroll, and a small wooden box that he placed carefully on the mantelpiece. For a man who claimed to have been saving money, he traveled remarkably light. "What's in the box?" Laura asked. "Personal things," he replied, and something in his tone warned her not to press for details. They spent the rest of the afternoon in awkward domesticity, trying to figure out how to share the small space and establish some kind of routine. Joshua was unfailingly polite, asking permission before moving anything and offering to help with tasks that Laura had always done alone. But there was a distance between them, a careful formality that reminded both of them that they were strangers who had agreed to live as husband and wife. That evening, as Laura prepared a simple supper, Joshua sat by the fireplace cleaning his rifle with practiced efficiency. The weapon was clearly well maintained and frequently used, and Laura found herself wondering exactly what kind of problems Joshua solved for his clients. "Tell me about your family," she said as they ate. There's not much to tell. My parents died when I was young. I've been on my own since I was 16. No brothers or sisters? None that I know of. The conversation died there, and Laura realized that Joshua was not inclined to share details about his past. She could hardly blame him, since she had not been entirely forthcoming about her own history either. They were both people who had learned to keep their secrets close. After supper, they faced the delicate question of sleeping arrangements. The cabin had only one bed, and while they were legally married, they were still essentially strangers. Joshua seemed to understand her discomfort without her having to voice it. "I'll sleep on the floor tonight," he said, "until you're more comfortable with the arrangement." Laura felt a rush of gratitude for his consideration. "Thank you. We're partners now, Laura. I don't want you to be afraid of me." It was the first time he had used her given name, and somehow that small intimacy made their situation feel more real. She was no longer Miss King, the desperate widow with impossible debts. She was Mrs. Ramirez, the wife of a man who had promised to protect her. They were settling in for the night when they heard the sound of horses approaching the cabin. Laura's blood turned to ice as she recognized the familiar rhythm of Edward Myers' horse, accompanied by what sounded like several other riders. "He's here," she whispered. Joshua was already moving, checking his rifle and positioning himself near the window where he could see outside. "Stay behind me," he said quietly. "Let me handle this." The pounding on the door came moments later, aggressive and demanding. Edward's voice followed, slurred with drink and ugly with anticipation. "Open up, Laura. Time to settle accounts." Joshua waited until the pounding stopped, then called out in a calm, steady voice, "The debt has been paid, Myers. Move along." There was a moment of surprised silence, then Edward's voice again, confused and angry. "Who the hell are you?" "I'm Laura's husband, and I'm telling you the debt is paid." "Like hell it is. She owes me $300 plus interest." Joshua opened the door just wide enough to toss out the leather pouch full of coins. It landed in the dirt at Edward's feet with a satisfying clink. $400, Joshua said. "That should cover everything." Laura watched through the window as Edward dismounted and scooped up the pouch, his eyes widening as he saw the gold and silver coins inside. For a moment, she thought he might actually take the money and leave. But then his expression hardened with a different kind of anger. "You think you can just ride into my town and steal what's mine?" Edward snarled. "I think I just paid a debt that was legally owed," Joshua replied. "The woman is my wife now. The debt is settled. We'll see about that." Edward remounted his horse, but instead of leaving, he positioned himself where he could see the cabin clearly. His three companions spread out around him, creating a loose circle that effectively trapped Joshua and Laura inside. "You made a mistake, stranger," Edward called out. "This is my town, and I don't like people who interfere in my business." Joshua closed the door and turned to Laura, his expression grim but not panicked. "How many men does he usually travel with?" "3 or 4. Sometimes more if he's expecting trouble." "And the local law?" "Sheriff Morrison is in Edward's pocket. He won't interfere." Joshua nodded as if he had expected as much. "Then we'll have to handle this ourselves." "What are you going to do?" "Whatever is necessary to protect you." The siege began that night and continued into the next day. Edward and his men took turns watching the cabin, making it clear that Joshua and Laura were not free to leave. Occasionally, one of them would ride close enough to shout threats or demands, but they made no move to actually attack. Laura realized that Edward was playing a waiting game, hoping to starve them out or force them to make a desperate attempt to escape. He had time on his side, and he knew it. Eventually, Joshua would have to make a move, and when he did, Edward would be ready. But if Edward thought he was dealing with an ordinary man, he was about to learn otherwise. On the second day of the siege, Joshua began to prepare for what Laura was beginning to realize was inevitable. He cleaned his rifle again, checked his ammunition, and spent long minutes studying the positions of Edward's men through the small windows of the cabin. His movements were calm and methodical, those of a man who had faced similar situations before and knew exactly what needed to be done. "How many men have you killed?" Laura asked quietly as she watched him work. Joshua paused in his preparations and looked at her with serious eyes. "Enough to know that I don't want to kill any more unless I have to. But you will if necessary." To protect you? Yes. The simple certainty in his voice should have frightened her, but instead, Laura found it oddly comforting. She had spent so many months feeling helpless and vulnerable that having someone willing to fight for her was almost overwhelming. I don't want you to die because of me, she said. I don't intend to die, Joshua replied. But I also don't intend to let Myers hurt you. One way or another, this ends today. As afternoon faded into evening, Joshua made his final preparations. He loaded his rifle and checked his pistol, then turned to Laura with instructions that made her heart race with fear. When the shooting starts, get down behind the bed and stay there no matter what you hear, he said. Don't come out until I tell you it's safe. What if something happens to you? If I don't come back, wait until dawn and then make your way to Pastor Williams. Tell him what happened and ask him to help you get out of town. Joshua! He silenced her with a gentle touch to her cheek, the first truly tender gesture he had made since their marriage. I'm not going to let anything happen to you, Laura. I promise. Then he was moving toward the door, rifle in hand, ready to face 4 armed men in a fight that would determine both their futures. Joshua stepped out into the gathering dusk with the confident stride of a man who had made his peace with whatever was about to happen. Edward and his men were positioned around the cabin in a loose perimeter, close enough to prevent escape but far enough away to avoid being easy targets themselves. Myers, Joshua called out. Let's finish this. About time. Edward's voice came from behind a large boulder about 50 yards from the cabin. You ready to die for that woman? Are you ready to die for money that's already been paid? Edward's laugh was harsh and ugly. This ain't about money anymore, stranger. This is about respect. You came into my town and made me look like a fool. That's something I can't let stand. Then come and do something about it. What followed was not the dramatic gunfight that Laura had expected from the stories she had heard. Instead, it was a careful, methodical elimination of threats that spoke of Joshua's experience and skill. He used the cabin's walls for cover, picking his shots carefully and making every bullet count. The first of Edward's men fell within minutes, caught in the open as he tried to move to a better position. The second lasted longer, engaging in a brief exchange of gunfire with Joshua before a well-placed shot ended his participation in the fight. Edward and his remaining companion realized they were outmatched and tried to retreat, but Joshua was already moving, using his knowledge of the terrain to cut off their escape routes. The third man panicked and broke cover, only to be brought down as he ran for his horse. That left only Edward Myers, the man who had terrorized Laura for months and who had forced this confrontation with his greed and arrogance. It's over, Myers, Joshua called out. Surrender now and I'll let you live. Edward's response was a wild shot that went wide of its target, followed by the sound of him cursing and fumbling with his weapon. Laura realized that he was drunk, which explained both his poor judgment in starting this fight and his inability to shoot straight. Joshua could have ended it then with a single shot, but instead he did something that surprised both Laura and Edward. He set down his rifle and stepped out into the open, his hands empty and visible. You want to settle this like men, Myers? Just you and me. No guns? Edward emerged from behind his boulder, swaying slightly but game for the challenge. He was a big man, taller than Joshua and heavier, with the kind of bulk that came from years of saloon brawling. But he was also drunk and out of shape, while Joshua moved with the fluid grace of someone who had kept himself in fighting condition. The fight was brief and brutal. Edward charged like an enraged bull, relying on his size and strength to overwhelm his opponent. But Joshua was faster and more skilled, using Edward's momentum against him and landing precise blows that quickly took their toll. When it was over, Edward Myers lay unconscious in the dirt. His reign of terror in Cedar Falls finally ended. Joshua stood over him, breathing hard but uninjured, the undisputed victor in a fight that had been inevitable from the moment he had chosen to protect Laura. Is he dead? Laura asked as she emerged from the cabin. No, just unconscious. He'll live, but I don't think he'll be causing you any more trouble. Joshua was right. When Edward regained consciousness, he found himself facing not only Joshua, but also several of the town's leading citizens who had been drawn by the sound of gunfire. The sight of 3 dead men and their own leader, beaten and humiliated, was enough to convince Edward's remaining followers that their boss's protection racket was finished. Within a week, Edward Myers had left Cedar Falls, taking his remaining men with him. The town seemed to breathe easier with his departure, and Laura found herself the recipient of friendly nods and respectful greetings from people who had previously avoided her out of fear of Edward's displeasure. But the most significant change was in her relationship with Joshua. The man who had married her out of practical necessity had risked his life to protect her, and that act had created a bond between them that went beyond their legal arrangement. "Why did you do it?" she asked him one evening as they sat by the fireplace in their cabin. "You could have been killed." "You're my wife," he said simply. "Protecting you is my responsibility. But we barely know each other. This marriage, it's just a business arrangement." Joshua looked at her for a long moment, and Laura saw something in his eyes that had not been there before. "Maybe it started that way," he said, "but it doesn't have to stay that way." The words hung in the air between them, full of possibility and promise. Laura felt her heart skip a beat as she realized that somewhere in the midst of their practical arrangement, something deeper had begun to grow. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I've come to care about you, Laura, more than I expected to, more than I thought possible. And I've come to care about you," she admitted, "when I thought you might be killed defending me. I realized that losing you would break my heart." Joshua reached for her hand, and this time his touch was not merely polite or formal. It was the touch of a man reaching for the woman he was beginning to love. "Then maybe we can make this marriage into something real," he said, "something built on more than just necessity." Laura squeezed his hand, feeling tears of relief and happiness prick at her eyes. "I'd like that very much." The weeks that followed Edward Myers's departure brought changes to Cedar Falls that no one had anticipated. Without his intimidating presence and corrupt influence, the town began to transform itself into the kind of community that families could thrive in. New businesses opened, honest law enforcement was established, and people who had lived in fear for years finally felt free to speak their minds and live their lives. For Laura and Joshua, the changes were even more profound. Their marriage, which had begun as a practical arrangement between strangers, was slowly evolving into something deeper and more meaningful. They were learning to trust each other, to share their thoughts and fears, and to build the kind of partnership that neither had believed possible. Joshua proved to be a considerate and thoughtful husband, always asking for Laura's opinion before making decisions that affected them both. He helped with household chores without being asked, brought her small gifts from his trips to town, and treated her with a respect and kindness that made her feel valued in ways she had never experienced before. Laura, in turn, discovered that she enjoyed taking care of Joshua in ways that went beyond mere wifely duty. She took pleasure in cooking his favorite meals, in mending his clothes with careful stitches, and in creating a warm and welcoming home that he was always eager to return to. She found herself looking forward to his company in the evenings, when they would sit by the fire and talk about their days, or simply enjoy each other's presence in comfortable silence. But it was the gradual revelation of Joshua's true character that affected Laura most profoundly. The man she had married was not just a skilled fighter or a practical problem solver. He was also intelligent, well-read, and surprisingly gentle. He had a dry sense of humor that emerged once he felt comfortable enough to let his guard down. And he showed genuine interest in her thoughts and opinions on everything from politics to philosophy. One evening, as they sat reading by the fireplace, Laura asked the question that had been bothering her for weeks. "Joshua, what did you really do before you came here? I know you said you solved problems for people, but that could mean anything." Joshua set down his book and looked at her thoughtfully. "Are you sure you want to know? Some stories are better left untold." "I'm sure. We're husband and wife now. I want to know who you really are." Joshua was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as if searching for the right words. When he spoke, his voice was careful and measured. "I was a bounty hunter," he said finally. "I tracked down men who had broken the law and brought them to justice when the regular authorities couldn't or wouldn't do it." Laura absorbed this information without surprise. She had suspected that Joshua's work involved violence, and bounty hunting was a legitimate, if dangerous, profession on the frontier. "Is that how you learned to fight so well?" "Partly, but I also served in the war. I was a scout for the Union Army, which meant I spent a lot of time behind enemy lines gathering information and eliminating threats. The casual way he mentioned eliminating threats sent a chill down Laura's spine, but she forced herself to remain calm. Joshua had never shown her anything but kindness and consideration. Whatever he had done in the past, it did not change who he was in the present. And after the war, I drifted for a while, taking whatever work I could find. Eventually, I started hiring myself out to people who needed problems solved. Sometimes that meant finding stolen property or missing persons. Sometimes it meant protecting people from threats the law couldn't handle. And sometimes, his voice grew harder, it meant making sure that justice was done when the courts failed. You mean you killed people? Only when they deserved it, only when there was no other way to stop them from hurting innocent people. Laura studied his face in the firelight, seeing the pain and weariness that his words had revealed. Joshua was not a man who took killing lightly, but he was also not a man who would hesitate to do what was necessary to protect those who could not protect themselves. "Is that why you answered my message?" she asked. "Because you saw me as someone who needed protection?" "Partly," Joshua admitted, "but also because I was tired of being alone, tired of always moving on, never having a place to call home or someone to care about. When I read your message, I saw a chance to have both. And now," Joshua reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers, "now I know I made the right choice. You've given me something I didn't even know I was looking for." "What's that?" "A reason to stop running from my past and start building a future." The conversation marked a turning point in their relationship. With Joshua's secrets finally revealed, the last barriers between them began to crumble. They started sharing more intimate details of their lives, their hopes and fears, their dreams for the future they were building together. Laura told Joshua about her childhood in Missouri, about the parents she had lost to illness and the sister she had not seen in years. She spoke of her first marriage to Thomas, of the love that had gradually been eroded by his gambling and drinking, and of the loneliness she had felt even before his death. Joshua, in turn, shared stories of his own childhood, of parents who had died in a cholera epidemic, and of the hard years that had followed as he learned to survive on his own. He spoke of the war and its aftermath, of the men he had known and lost, and of the gradual realization that violence, while sometimes necessary, was not a foundation on which to build a meaningful life. As winter approached, their conversations grew longer and more intimate. They began to share not just their histories, but their hopes for the future. Joshua spoke of his desire to buy more land and build a proper ranch where they could raise cattle and horses. Laura talked about her dream of having children and creating the kind of stable, loving home she had never known as a child. "Do you think we could be happy here?" Laura asked one snowy evening as they sat close together on the small sofa Joshua had built for the cabin. "I think we already are," Joshua replied, his arm tightening around her shoulders. It was true. Somewhere in the midst of their practical arrangement, they had found something neither had expected: genuine happiness. They had learned to appreciate each other's strengths, to accept each other's flaws, and to work together toward common goals. But it was not until the night of the first major snowstorm that they finally acknowledged the full depth of their feelings for each other. Laura had been restless all evening, troubled by dreams and memories she could not quite shake. Joshua, sensing her distress, had stayed awake with her, offering quiet comfort and gentle conversation. As the storm raged outside their small cabin, they found themselves talking about things they had never discussed before. "I used to think love was just a pretty word for need," Laura said as she watched the snow pile up against their windows. "Thomas said he loved me, but what he really loved was the idea of having someone to take care of him. And I thought I loved him, but maybe what I really loved was feeling needed and important." "And now?" Joshua asked. "Now I think love is something different. It's not about needing someone or being needed. It's about choosing someone every day, even when it's difficult. It's about wanting their happiness more than your own." Joshua was quiet for a moment. Then he turned to look at her with eyes that held all the tenderness she had ever dreamed of seeing. "Then I love you, Laura Ramirez," he said, "because I choose you every day, and your happiness has become more important to me than my own." "And I love you, Joshua Ramirez," Laura replied, her heart full of a joy she had never thought possible. "Not because I need you, though I do, and not because you saved me, though you did. I love you because of who you are and because of who I become when I'm with you. When Joshua kissed her that night, it was not the formal peck on the cheek of their wedding day or the careful, respectful touches they had shared since then. It was the kiss of a man who had found his heart's desire in the last place he had expected to look, and of a woman who had discovered that true love was not about fairy tale romance, but about finding someone willing to build a real life with you, day by day and choice by choice. Spring came early to Cedar Falls that year, bringing with it new growth and new possibilities. Laura and Joshua had settled into a comfortable rhythm of married life, their relationship deepening with each passing day. The practical arrangement that had brought them together had blossomed into a genuine love match, built on mutual respect, shared goals, and the kind of deep understanding that comes only from weathering storms together. Joshua had used his savings to purchase additional land adjacent to their cabin, and they spent the warm days of early spring planning the ranch they would build together. Laura discovered that she had a natural talent for organizing and managing the practical aspects of their growing operation, while Joshua's experience and connections helped them acquire the livestock and equipment they needed. But it was the news that Laura received on a warm April morning that truly marked the beginning of their new life together. "Joshua," she called as he returned from checking on their small herd of cattle. "I need to tell you something." Something in her tone made him hurry to her side, concern evident in his expression. "What is it? Are you all right?" Laura smiled, her face glowing with a happiness that seemed to light up the entire cabin. "I'm pregnant." Joshua's face went through a series of expressions: shock, joy, wonder, and finally a tenderness so profound that it brought tears to Laura's eyes. He reached for her carefully, as if she were made of the finest porcelain, and pulled her into his arms. "Are you sure?" he whispered. "I'm sure. Dr. Henderson confirmed it this morning when I went to town for supplies." "A baby," Joshua said, his voice full of awe. "Our baby. Are you happy?" "Happy?" Joshua laughed, a sound of pure joy that Laura had never heard from him before. "Laura, I'm so happy I can barely think straight. You've given me everything I never dared to hope for. A home, a wife I love more than life itself, and now a child." They spent the rest of the day making plans and dreams, talking about names and nurseries and all the ways their lives would change with the arrival of their first child. Joshua was already planning additions to the cabin and talking about hiring help so that Laura could rest during the later stages of her pregnancy. But their joy was tempered by practical concerns. Childbirth on the frontier was always dangerous, and they were still relatively isolated despite the improvements to the town. Joshua began making arrangements to ensure that Laura would have the best possible care when the time came, even if it meant traveling to a larger town with better medical facilities. "I'm not going to lose you," he told her one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "I can't lose you, Laura. You and this baby are everything to me now." "You're not going to lose me," Laura assured him, placing his hand on her still flat stomach. "We're stronger than that, all three of us." As summer progressed and Laura's pregnancy became more apparent, they received an unexpected visitor. Laura was hanging laundry when she saw a familiar figure approaching on horseback. Her sister Sarah, whom she had not seen in over 2 years, was riding up to their cabin with a determined expression on her face. "Sarah!" Laura called out, dropping the sheet she had been hanging and running to embrace her sister. "What are you doing here?" "I came as soon as I heard," Sarah said, dismounting and hugging Laura tightly. "Word reached St. Louis about what happened with Edward Myers and about your marriage. I had to see for myself that you were all right." Laura introduced Sarah to Joshua, watching nervously as her sister assessed the man Laura had married. Sarah was older and more worldly than Laura, with strong opinions and little patience for fools. Her approval would mean everything to Laura, but it was not guaranteed. "So you're the man who married my sister," Sarah said, studying Joshua with sharp eyes. "I am," Joshua replied calmly, "and I consider myself the luckiest man alive because of it." Sarah continued her assessment for several long moments, then nodded approvingly. "Good answer. Laura, he'll do." The visit lasted for 2 weeks, during which Sarah helped Laura prepare for the baby and got to know Joshua better. By the time she left, She had become one of Joshua's strongest supporters, telling Laura privately that she had never seen her sister so happy or so confident. "He's good for you," Sarah said on her last night. "Thomas was a boy who needed a mother. This one is a man who wants a partner. There's a big difference." "I know," Laura replied. "I'm not the same person I was when I was married to Thomas. Joshua sees me as I really am, and he loves me anyway." "More than that," Sarah observed, "he loves you because of who you really are, not in spite of it. Hold on to this one, Laura. Men like him are rare." After Sarah's departure, Laura and Joshua settled back into their routine, but with a new sense of confidence and security. Having her sister's approval meant more to Laura than she had realized, and knowing that their love was visible to others made it feel even more real and permanent. As autumn arrived and Laura's pregnancy progressed, they faced their first real test as a married couple. Laura developed complications that required her to spend several weeks on bed rest, unable to help with the ranch work or even the basic household tasks she had always handled. Joshua rose to the challenge without complaint, taking over all of Laura's responsibilities while continuing to manage his own work. He cooked and cleaned, tended the animals, and handled the business aspects of their growing operation, all while providing Laura with the care and attention she needed. "I'm sorry I can't help more," Laura said one evening, as Joshua brought her dinner in bed. "Don't apologize," Joshua replied firmly. "Your job right now is to take care of yourself and our baby. Everything else can wait." "But the ranch will survive. We're not going anywhere, Laura. We have the rest of our lives to build this place. Right now, the only thing that matters is making sure you and the baby are healthy." His devotion during those difficult weeks only deepened Laura's love for him. She had never had anyone care for her with such selfless dedication, and she began to understand what true partnership really meant. It was not just about sharing the good times, but about supporting each other through the challenges and difficulties that life inevitably brought. When Dr. Henderson finally declared that Laura was out of danger and could resume normal activities, she felt as though she and Joshua had passed through a trial by fire and emerged stronger than ever. "We make a good team," she told him as they sat together on their porch, watching the first snow of winter begin to fall. "The best," Joshua agreed, his arm around her shoulders and his hand resting protectively on her rounded belly. "And we're just getting started." Winter brought both challenges and blessings to the Ramirez household. Laura's pregnancy progressed smoothly after her earlier complications, and she bloomed with health and happiness as her due date approached. Joshua had hired a local woman, Mrs. Patterson, to help with the household tasks and to provide assistance when the baby arrived. The cabin had been expanded and improved throughout the year, with Joshua adding 2 new rooms and a proper kitchen. What had once been a simple frontier dwelling was now a comfortable family home, filled with handmade furniture and the kind of personal touches that spoke of permanence and love. On a cold February night, with snow falling steadily outside, Laura went into labor. Joshua had made all the preparations he could think of, but nothing had really prepared him for the reality of watching the woman he loved go through the ordeal of childbirth. Dr. Henderson had arrived hours earlier, along with Mrs. Patterson, and they had taken over the bedroom, while Joshua paced the main room like a caged animal. "First babies take their time," Mrs. Patterson assured him during one of her brief appearances. "Laura's doing fine. She's stronger than she looks." Joshua knew that was true. Over the past year, he had watched Laura transform from a frightened, desperate woman into someone confident and capable. She had faced down Edward Myers, survived a difficult pregnancy, and built a new life from nothing. If anyone could handle the challenges of childbirth, it was Laura. But that knowledge did not make the waiting any easier. Dawn was breaking when he finally heard the sound he had been waiting for, the strong, healthy cry of a newborn baby. Joshua's knees nearly buckled with relief, and he had to grip the back of a chair to steady himself. Dr. Henderson emerged from the bedroom a few minutes later, his face tired but smiling. "Congratulations, Mr. Ramirez. You have a son." "A son," Joshua repeated, the words not quite seeming real. "And Laura?" "She's tired but fine. She wants to see you." Joshua entered the bedroom on unsteady legs, his heart pounding with a mixture of joy and awe. Laura was propped up against the pillows, pale and exhausted but radiant with happiness. In her arms was a small bundle wrapped in a soft blanket, and when Joshua approached, She pulled back the fabric to reveal the tiny face of their son. "Isn't he beautiful?" Laura whispered. Joshua looked down at the baby, at the perfect miniature features and the tiny hands that were already grasping at the air, and felt his heart expand in ways he had not known were possible. This was his child, his son, a living symbol of the love he shared with Laura. "He's perfect," Joshua said, his voice thick with emotion. "Just like his mother." "What should we name him?" Laura asked. They had discussed names throughout the pregnancy, but had never been able to agree on one they both loved. Now looking at their son, Joshua knew exactly what he wanted to call him. "Thomas," he said, "after your first husband. He may not have been perfect, but he brought you to this place, and that brought you to me." Laura's eyes filled with tears at the generous gesture. Naming their son after Thomas was Joshua's way of acknowledging that her past was part of what had made her the woman he loved. "Thomas Ramirez," she said, testing the sound of it. "I like it." "Thomas Ramirez," Joshua repeated, reaching out to touch his son's tiny hand. "Welcome to the world, little man." The next few weeks were a blur of sleepless nights, endless feedings, and the kind of exhausted happiness that comes with new parenthood. Joshua threw himself into fatherhood with the same dedication he brought to everything else, learning to change diapers and prepare bottles, walking the floor with a crying baby, and marveling at every small development in his son's growth. Laura recovered quickly from the birth, and soon she was back to managing the household and helping with the ranch work, though now with a baby strapped to her chest or sleeping in a basket nearby. She had a natural talent for motherhood, and watching her with Thomas filled Joshua with a contentment he had never imagined possible. "You're a good father," Laura told him one evening as they sat by the fire, Thomas sleeping peacefully in Joshua's arms. "I'm learning," Joshua replied. "I never had a father to teach me, so I'm making it up as I go along." "You're doing fine, more than fine. Thomas is lucky to have you." "We're all lucky," Joshua said, looking around the comfortable room that had become their sanctuary. "A year ago, neither of us could have imagined this." It was true. The practical arrangement that had brought them together had evolved into something far richer and more meaningful than either had dared to hope. They had built not just a marriage but a true partnership, not just a house but a home, not just a life together but a legacy for their children. As spring returned to Cedar Falls, bringing with it the promise of new growth and new possibilities, the Ramirez family settled into the rhythm of their expanded life. Joshua continued to develop their ranch, gradually building it into one of the most successful operations in the territory. Laura managed the household and cared for Thomas, while also taking on more of the business responsibilities that came with their growing prosperity. But their greatest joy was in watching their son grow and develop. Thomas was a healthy, happy baby who seemed to inherit the best qualities of both his parents. He had his mother's dark eyes and his father's strong jaw, and even at a few months old, he showed signs of the intelligence and determination that characterized both Laura and Joshua. "He's going to be trouble," Laura said one afternoon, as she watched Thomas trying to crawl toward a sunbeam on the floor. "The best kind of trouble," Joshua agreed, scooping up his son and lifting him high in the air, delighting in the baby's giggles of joy. That evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset and listening to the sounds of their growing ranch, Laura reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't answered my message?" she asked. Joshua considered the question seriously. "Sometimes, but not for long. Some things are meant to be, Laura. We were meant to find each other. Even though we started as strangers, especially because we started as strangers. We had no expectations, no preconceptions about what we should be to each other. We were free to become exactly what we needed to become." Laura nodded, understanding what he meant. Their love had grown organically, without the pressure of romantic expectations or social conventions. They had been allowed to discover each other gradually, to build trust and affection based on shared experiences and mutual respect. "I love you, Joshua Ramirez," she said, the words carrying all the weight of the year they had shared and the lifetime they had ahead of them. "And I love you, Laura Ramirez," he replied, reaching for her hand. "More than I ever thought possible." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, they sat in comfortable silence, each lost in thoughts of the past and dreams of the future. They had traveled a long road to reach this moment of perfect contentment, but every step had been worth it. 2 years later, the Ramirez Ranch had become one of the most prosperous in the territory, and the family had grown by one more member. Little Sarah, named after Laura's sister, was a year old and already showing signs of the same strong will that characterized her parents and older brother. Joshua had proven to be as successful a rancher as he had been a bounty hunter, though his methods were considerably more peaceful. He had a natural talent for working with animals and an instinct for business that had served them well. The ranch now employed several hands and supported not just their own family, but several others in the growing community. Laura had evolved into the kind of woman she had never imagined she could become: confident, capable, and secure in her place in the world. She managed the household with efficiency and grace, raised her children with love and wisdom, and supported Joshua's business ventures with intelligence and insight. The frightened, desperate widow who had sent that first message to a stranger was gone, replaced by a woman who knew her own worth and was not afraid to claim her place in the world. But it was on a warm summer evening, as they celebrated Thomas's second birthday with friends and neighbors, that Laura truly understood how completely their lives had been transformed. The celebration was held in the yard behind their expanded house, which now boasted 6 rooms and all the comforts of a proper home. Tables groaned under the weight of food prepared by Laura and the other women of the community, while the men gathered around Joshua, discussing cattle prices and weather patterns with the easy camaraderie of successful neighbors. Children ran through the gathering, their laughter mixing with the adult conversation to create a symphony of contentment and community. Thomas, now a sturdy toddler with his father's confident stride and his mother's warm smile, was the center of attention as he opened his presents and basked in the affection of his extended family of friends and neighbors. "Hard to believe this is the same place where you faced down Edward Myers," said Jack Johnson, one of their neighbors and close friends. Joshua nodded, his eyes finding Laura across the yard where she was serving cake to a group of children. "Sometimes I have to pinch myself to make sure it's all real." "You two have built something special here," Jack continued. "Not just the ranch, but the family, the community. You've made this whole area a better place to live." It was true, the success of the Ramirez Ranch had attracted other families to the area, and what had once been an isolated frontier settlement was now a thriving community with a school, a proper church, and several successful businesses. Joshua and Laura had become unofficial leaders in the community, respected for their fairness, their generosity, and their commitment to making life better for everyone. As the evening wore on and the guests began to drift home, Laura found herself standing on the porch with baby Sarah in her arms, watching Joshua play with Thomas in the yard. The sight of her husband and son together, so obviously devoted to each other, filled her with a happiness so profound it almost took her breath away. "Mama!" Thomas called out, running toward her on unsteady legs. "Up!" Laura shifted Sarah to one arm and lifted Thomas with the other, marveling at how natural it felt to balance both children while still feeling completely in control. Motherhood had given her a strength and confidence she had never possessed before. Joshua joined them on the porch, his face glowing with the satisfaction of a man who had found his place in the world. "Good party," he said, slipping his arm around Laura's waist. "The best," Laura agreed. "I love seeing everyone so happy." "I love seeing you so happy," Joshua replied, pressing a kiss to her temple. "You were born for this, Laura. For family, for community, for building something lasting and meaningful." "We both were," she corrected. "We just had to find each other first." As they stood together on their porch, surrounded by the evidence of the life they had built together, Laura thought about the message she had sent to a stranger 3 years earlier. She had been looking for a husband who could protect her from immediate danger, but she had found so much more than that. She had found a partner who challenged her to become her best self, a father who would give their children the security and love they deserved, and a man who had shown her that true love was not about fairy tale romance, but about choosing each other every day and building something beautiful together. "Do you ever miss your old life?" Laura asked as they watched the last of their guests disappear into the gathering dusk. Joshua considered the question seriously, as he always did when she asked him something important. "I miss the freedom sometimes," he said finally. The ability to just pick up and go wherever the road led. But I don't miss the loneliness, and I don't miss the uncertainty. This is better. This is home. Even when Thomas is teething, and Sarah has colic, and the cattle are getting into the neighbor's corn, Joshua laughed, the sound rich and warm in the evening air. Especially then. The hard parts make the good parts even better. Laura understood what he meant. Their life was not always easy, but it was always meaningful. Every challenge they faced together made them stronger. Every joy they shared made them more grateful for what they had built. As they prepared to go inside and put the children to bed, Laura took one last look around the ranch that had become their kingdom. The house where they had learned to love each other, the barn where Joshua worked with the horses he loved, the fields where their cattle grazed peacefully, the garden where she grew vegetables for their table and flowers for their home. It was not the life she had dreamed of as a young girl, but it was better than any dream because it was real. It was built on solid foundations of mutual respect, shared work, and genuine affection. It was a life that could weather storms and celebrate sunshine with equal grace. "Come on," Joshua said, holding the door open for her. "Let's get these two settled for the night." As Laura carried Sarah inside and Joshua followed with Thomas, she felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought them to this moment. The desperate message she had sent to a stranger had changed not just her life, but the lives of everyone around her. It had created a family, built a community, and proven that sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected places. 5 years had passed since that desperate night when Laura had first laid eyes on Joshua Ramirez, and the transformation in both their lives was nothing short of miraculous. The ranch had grown into one of the most successful operations in 3 territories, employing dozens of workers and supporting an entire community that had sprung up around their success. Thomas was now 7 years old, a bright and energetic boy who spent his days helping his father with the horses and learning the skills he would need to eventually take over the family business. Sarah, at 6, was already showing signs of her mother's intelligence and her father's determination, equally comfortable in the kitchen, learning to cook, or in the barn, learning to care for the animals. But the biggest change was the addition of twin boys Joshua Jr. and David, who had arrived 2 years earlier and filled the house with even more laughter and chaos. Laura often joked that she had gone from being a desperate widow with no prospects to the mother of 4 children and the wife of one of the most respected men in the territory. The house had been expanded twice more to accommodate their growing family, and it now sprawled across a small hill overlooking the ranch with wide porches and large windows that filled every room with light and air. It was the kind of home Laura had dreamed of as a child, but never thought she would actually possess. On this particular autumn evening, as Laura stood in her kitchen preparing dinner for her family, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment of perfect contentment. The woman who had once been afraid to open her door at night now managed a household of 6, supervised a staff of domestic workers, and served as an unofficial leader in a community that looked to her for guidance and support. "Mama, the twins are getting into the chicken coop again," Sarah called from the back door. Laura sighed and wiped her hands on her apron. "Thomas, go help your sister catch your brothers before they terrorize those poor chickens to death." "Yes, ma'am," Thomas replied, setting down the book he had been reading and heading outside with the resigned air of an older brother who had dealt with this situation many times before. Laura watched through the window as her 3 older children worked together to corral the twins, and she felt the familiar surge of pride and love that always came when she saw how well her children had learned to cooperate and care for each other. Joshua had been right when he said he would give her strong children. All 4 of them had inherited his determination and her resilience, creating a combination that would serve them well in whatever challenges life brought their way. "Looks like we're raising a pack of wild animals," Joshua said, coming up behind her and slipping his arms around her waist. "You're wild animals," Laura replied, leaning back against his chest. "They get their adventurous spirit from you." "And their intelligence from you," Joshua countered. "Did you see Thomas working on that arithmetic problem this morning? He's going to be ready for advanced mathematics soon. And Sarah wants to learn to read Latin because she heard Pastor Williams mention it in church last Sunday." They stood together at the window, watching their children play in the yard that had once been the site of a desperate confrontation with Edward Myers. It was hard to believe that this peaceful domestic scene had grown from such violent and uncertain beginnings. Do you ever think about what our lives would have been like if things had gone differently? Laura asked. You mean if I hadn't answered your message? Or if Edward had killed you that night? Or if we hadn't been able to make our marriage work? Joshua tightened his arms around her, his voice serious when he replied. I try not to think about those possibilities because they're too terrible to contemplate. I can't imagine my life without you and the children. You've given me everything I never knew I wanted. And you've given me everything I was afraid to hope for, Laura replied. Safety, security, love, family, a place in the world where I belong. You've given yourself those things, Joshua corrected. I just provided the opportunity. You're the one who had the courage to reach out for help. And you're the one who had the strength to build something beautiful from a desperate situation. It was a conversation they had had many times over the years, each of them crediting the other with the success of their marriage and family. But Laura knew that Joshua was right. She had changed dramatically from the frightened woman who had sent that first message, and the change had come from within her own character and determination. Dinner's ready, she called to the children, and they came running in from the yard, the twins chattering excitedly about their adventure with the chickens, while Thomas and Sarah rolled their eyes at their younger brother's antics. As they gathered around the large table Joshua had built to accommodate their growing family, Laura looked at each face in turn and marveled at the richness of the life they had created together. Thomas, serious and thoughtful like his father, but with her warm heart. Sarah, bright and determined with Joshua's confidence and her own quick wit. The twins, still too young to show their full personalities, but already displaying the energy and curiosity that seemed to run in the family. Papa, tell us about the time you fought the bad men, David demanded, as he did at almost every meal. Eat your vegetables first, Joshua replied, as he always did. Stories come after dinner. But we want to hear about how you saved Mama, Joshua Jr. added, not to be outdone by his twin. Laura smiled at the familiar routine. The story of how their parents had met had become family legend, told and retold until it had taken on mythical proportions in the children's minds. They loved hearing about their father's heroic rescue of their mother, though Laura always made sure to add her own perspective about the importance of being brave enough to ask for help when you needed it. Your father was very brave, Laura said, serving vegetables onto the twins' plates. But the most important thing he did was keep his promise to protect our family. And Mama was brave too, Thomas added, having heard this discussion many times before. She was brave enough to marry a stranger because she knew it was the right thing to do. That's right, Joshua agreed. Sometimes being brave means fighting bad men with guns, but sometimes it means making difficult choices and trusting that things will work out for the best. After dinner, as had become their custom, the family gathered in the living room for story time. Joshua told the children about his adventures as a young man, carefully editing out the more violent details, while Laura worked on her sewing and listened to the familiar tales with half an ear. But tonight, something made her pay closer attention to the story Joshua was telling about a job he had taken years before their marriage. It was about a family that had been threatened by outlaws and how Joshua had helped them find safety and build a new life in a different territory. What happened to them after you left? Sarah asked. I don't know, Joshua admitted. I hope they found happiness and built a good life together. That's what I always hope for the people I helped. Like you and Mama did, Thomas observed. Exactly like your mother and I did, Joshua agreed, his eyes finding Laura's across the room. Later, after the children had been put to bed and the house had settled into peaceful quiet, Laura and Joshua sat together on their front porch, enjoying the cool evening air and the satisfaction of another day well lived. Do you think the children understand how lucky we are? Laura asked. I think they take it for granted, which is exactly as it should be, Joshua replied. They should grow up assuming that families love each other and take care of each other. They should expect security and stability and happiness as their birthright. Because we didn't have those things when we were young. Exactly. We've given them something neither of us had, and that's the greatest gift we could possibly offer. As they sat together in comfortable silence, Laura thought about the message she had sent to a stranger 7 years earlier. She had been looking for a husband who could give her strong children, but she had found so much more than that. She had found a partner who had helped her discover her own strength, a love that had grown deeper and richer with each passing year, and a family that had exceeded her wildest dreams. "I have no regrets," she said suddenly. "About what?" "About any of it. The desperate situation that brought us together, the practical way we started our marriage, the struggles we faced. All of it led to this, and this is perfect." Joshua reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers in the gesture that had become second nature to them both. "I love you, Laura Ramirez. And I love you, Joshua Ramirez. Thank you for answering my message. Thank you for sending it." As the stars appeared in the darkening sky above their ranch, above their home, above the life they had built together from nothing but courage and determination, Laura felt a deep sense of completion. She had asked for a husband who could give her strong children, and she had received that and so much more. She had received a love story for the ages, built not on fairy tale romance, but on the solid foundation of mutual respect, shared work, and the daily choice to love and support each other through whatever challenges life might bring. 10 years had passed since that fateful night when Joshua Ramirez had appeared at Laura's door, and the story of their meeting had become legend throughout the territory. The desperate widow who had sent a message to a stranger asking for a husband had become the matriarch of one of the most successful and respected families in 3 states, while the mysterious bounty hunter who had answered her call had transformed into a pillar of the community and a devoted family man. The Ramirez Ranch now sprawled across thousands of acres, supporting not just their own large family, but an entire town that had grown up around their success. Cedar Falls had evolved from a rough frontier settlement into a thriving community with schools, churches, businesses, and all the amenities of civilized life. And at the heart of it all was the family that had started with a practical arrangement between strangers and had grown into something beautiful and enduring. Laura stood on the porch of their grand house, watching her children play in the yard that had once been the site of her darkest hour. Thomas, now 17, was teaching his younger siblings to rope cattle, his movements confident and sure as he demonstrated the skills his father had taught him. Sarah, 16 and already showing signs of becoming a formidable woman in her own right, was helping the twins with their lessons, while keeping one eye on baby Elizabeth, the youngest of their 6 children. The twins, now 12, were full of energy and mischief, constantly getting into adventures that reminded Laura of their father's stories about his own wild youth. And little Elizabeth, just 2 years old, was already showing signs of the intelligence and determination that seemed to run in the family. "Quite a view," Joshua said, joining Laura on the porch and slipping his arm around her waist in the gesture that had become as natural as breathing over their years together. "The best view in the world," Laura agreed, leaning into his embrace. They had both changed over the years. Joshua's dark hair now showed threads of silver, and lines of experience marked his face, but his eyes still held the same steady strength that had first attracted Laura to him. Laura herself had grown into the kind of woman she had never imagined she could become, confident, capable, and secure in her place in the world. "Hard to believe it's been 10 years, Joshua mused. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday," Laura replied. "Sometimes it feels like a lifetime." "Any regrets?" It was a question they asked each other periodically, a way of checking in on their relationship and making sure they were both still happy with the choices they had made. The answer was always the same, but it was important to ask. "None," Laura said firmly. "Not a single one." "You?" "Only that I waited so long to find you," Joshua replied, pressing a kiss to her temple. As they stood together watching their children, Laura reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment of perfect contentment. She had started as a desperate woman with no options, and through courage and determination, she had built a life that exceeded her wildest dreams. But more than that, she had discovered that true love was not about fairy tale romance or instant passion. It was about choosing each other every day, supporting each other through challenges, and building something meaningful together brick by brick and choice by choice. "Mama, Papa," Sarah called from the yard. "Come see what Elizabeth is doing." They walked down into the yard where their youngest daughter was taking her first tentative steps, her face bright with determination as she toddled toward her father's outstretched arms. Joshua scooped her up and spun her around, delighting in her giggles of joy. "She's going to be trouble," Thomas observed with the wisdom of an older brother who had seen this pattern before. "The best kind of trouble," Laura agreed, remembering Joshua's words from years earlier when Thomas had been the one learning to walk. As the sun set over their ranch, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the Ramirez family gathered on their porch for their evening ritual of stories and conversation. It was a tradition that had started when Thomas was small and had continued through the addition of each new child, a way of staying connected as a family despite the busy demands of their growing enterprise. Tonight, as often happened, the children asked to hear the story of how their parents had met. It was a tale that never grew old, no matter how many times it was told, because it was the foundation story of their family, the beginning of everything they had become. "Tell us about the message Mama sent," David demanded. "And about how Papa rode through the night to save her," Joshua Jr. added. "It wasn't quite that dramatic," Laura laughed, settling into her rocking chair with Elizabeth on her lap. But as Joshua began the familiar tale, Laura found herself thinking not about the dramatic elements that so captured the children's imagination, but about the quieter moments that had really mattered. The conversation by lamplight when they had decided to trust each other. The gradual building of respect and affection that had grown into love. The daily choices to support and care for each other that had created the foundation of their happiness. "The most important part," Joshua said, reaching the end of the story, "is that your mother was brave enough to ask for help when she needed it, and smart enough to recognize that sometimes the best things in life come from unexpected places." "And Papa was brave enough to answer," Sarah added. "We were both brave enough to take a chance on each other," Laura corrected, "and lucky enough to discover that we were exactly what the other needed." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, the children gradually drifted off to bed, leaving Laura and Joshua alone on the porch with their thoughts and memories. It was their favorite time of day, when they could sit together in comfortable silence and reflect on the life they had built together. "Do you think they understand how special this is?" Laura asked, gesturing toward the house full of sleeping children and the ranch that surrounded them. "I think they take it for granted, which is exactly as it should be," Joshua replied. "They should grow up assuming that love and security and happiness are normal. They should expect to be cherished and supported and encouraged to become their best selves. Because we didn't have that." "Exactly. We've given them something neither of us had, and that's the greatest gift we could possibly offer." As they prepared to go inside and end another perfect day, Laura took one last look around the ranch that had become their kingdom. The house where they had learned to love each other. The barn where Joshua worked with the horses he loved. The fields where their cattle grazed peacefully. The garden where she grew vegetables for their table and flowers for their home. But most importantly, she looked at the man beside her, the stranger who had appeared at her door 10 years earlier and had become the center of her world. Joshua Ramirez had given her everything she had asked for in that desperate message: protection, security, and strong children. But he had also given her things she had never dared to ask for: love, partnership, and a sense of belonging that had transformed her from a frightened victim into a confident woman who knew her own worth. "Ready to go in?" Joshua asked, holding out his hand to her. "Ready," Laura replied, taking his hand and allowing him to help her to her feet. As they walked into their house together, surrounded by the evidence of the life they had built and the family they had created, Laura felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought them to this moment. The desperate message she had sent to a stranger had changed not just her life, but the lives of everyone around her. It had created a family, built a community, and proven that sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin with the most practical arrangements. She had asked for a husband who could give her strong children, and she had received that and so much more. She had received a love that had grown deeper and richer with each passing year, a partnership that had weathered every storm, and a family that was her greatest achievement and her most precious treasure. And as she and Joshua climbed the stairs to their bedroom, hand in hand as they had done every night for 10 years, Laura knew that their story was far from over. There would be more challenges to face, more joys to celebrate, and more years of choosing each other every day. But whatever the future brought, they would face it together, just as they had faced everything else, with courage, determination, and the unshakable knowledge that they were exactly where they belonged. The rugged stranger who had shown up at her door saying he had heard she needed a husband had given her strong children, just as he had promised. But more than that, he had given her a life beyond her wildest dreams and a love that would last forever.